We have made significant gains. I can quote back to you all of the stats that others have given over the last couple of weeks as we reach this one-year anniversary in this struggle. But overall, I think we have seen gains on the ground.
You mentioned gains. Well, since the beginning of bombings last year, ISIL grew in territory. In front of me, I have the map of the territory that they control from September of last year and from this September, and it is considerably bigger. I can show you that. The number of fighters, as I understand, stayed about the same. Does that sound like a result of does it sound like gains? Does it sound like a result of a winning strategy?
Again, we've seen, certainly in Iraq, you've seen ISIL lose ground at Mosul Dam, Tikrit, other places.
What seems to be at the bottom of the disagreement between Russia and the U.S. over how to move forward in Syria is Russia saying whether or not you support Bashar Assad, the international community should do everything for Syria not to become a failed state. The U.S. says Assad must go, even if Syria goes with it. Well, they don't say it in those exact words, but that's what the policies seem to demonstrate. The U.S. has tried a similar approach before. The U.S. wanted Iraq's Saddam Hussein gone, even if it came at the price of unleashing a devastating sectarian war. One of the outcomes of that policy was the creation of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later became ISIL. President Obama spoke to that.
ISIL is a direct outgrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq that grew out of our invasion, which is an example of unintended consequences.
More recently, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi was declared evil of all evils and done away with. What followed was an ungoverned Libya, which became, according to the head of U.S. intelligence, a magnet for terrorism.
In addition to ISIL, probably 6 or 8 other terrorist groups that have gathered in Libya. So it's a magnet because of essentially it's ungoverned.
Syria is already a major hub for terrorists, and a year of U.S.-led coalition bombings have not stopped that. Attempts to arm and train moderate Syrian rebels have all but failed. A Pentagon official testified in Congress this Wednesday saying there are now, quote, 4 or 5 U.S.-trained Syrian rebels on the battlefield to take on the Islamic State. So 4 or 5 trained fighters, despite millions of dollars spent on the program. With that arises the question, who exactly is going to do the fighting if Syria becomes a failed state? In Washington, I'm Ganesh Chekan, RT.
And later we'll be speaking more about this with Hans-Christoph von Sponeck, a former UN Assistant Secretary General and Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. Now, Ukraine is expanding its list of sanctions against individuals, adding around 400 people to it, including journalists. And it's not only Russian ones. Journalists from Germany, Spain, Israel and the UK have also been added. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined live by RT's Anna Cecilia Churtner, who joins us there. Good to see you. So why has Kiev expanded its sanctions to include dozens of international journalists?
Well, you know, this is a step that some analysts are already dubbing sort of an extravaganza of absurdity, because instead of looking at the issues inside the country, we're seeing the Ukrainian president put in place this list of banned individuals and organizations that is very curious in scope and substance, because it's a huge list. The decree that he signed is 135 pages long and includes almost 400 individuals, including dozens of journalists. And if the list and the selection isn't curious, it really is hard to say what is, because people who are indicated as seen as a threat to what he calls a threat to national security include dozens of journalists, like we said, including at least 3 reporters, 3 journalists from the BBC, of course, a news organization that has not exactly been seen as anti-Ukrainian government in this entire Ukrainian crisis coverage. We also know that the list includes at least 2 Spanish journalists from the El País newspaper, and what's curious here is that these 2 journalists are considered to be actually missing and are assumed to have been captured by ISIS and are nowhere near Ukraine as we speak. Also, the list includes journalists from a German newspaper, as well as journalists from RT's video news agency, Ruppli. But you know, when it comes to Russian journalists, of course, in this crisis, there's nothing curious there, because when something happens against them in this conflict, what's been going on in Ukraine. Everybody kind of yawns, but this is quite a twist because these are Western journalists that are being targeted. We're hearing analysts saying this is, of course, a violation of media freedom and a violation of the Helsinki Acts, because obviously journalists are supposed to be able to do their job, and it's kind of seen as absurd because the media, of course, has played quite a crucial role and has unraveled an information war of its own when it comes to this Ukrainian crisis. And of course, a lot of the Western media has been seen as more sort of supporting the Ukrainian president. So the fact that he's taking measures and steps in terms of banning them from the country is something that's certainly raising eyebrows, and it's not exactly clear why these steps would be taken. And of course, the list does not just end there. It includes individuals from countries like France, Greece, Israel, Italy, the US, and the UK. But of course, you know, considering people like the French actor Gérard Depardieu have also been thrown into that list, I think it's one that's considered quite curious in more ways than one.
Anastasia, thank you very much. Anastasia Chukina reporting there. Now, back to our top story here on RT International. That's that a US State Department spokesman suggests that Middle East countries, including Iraq and Libya, are better off after America's intervention. Well, we now have the chance to speak more on this with Hans Christoph von Sponeck, a former UN Assistant Secretary General and Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Thank you very much for joining us here on RT International. I hope you can hear me. So Washington believes then that intervention...
Yes, I can hear you well.
That's good to hear. Washington believes then that its intervention in Iraq was a success. What's your assessment of that?
I don't know what they're talking about. I think all the indicators that we can witness without reading papers, we can just see pictures, tell us that the destruction of a state continues. And I see absolutely no progress whatsoever. You have a problem in the north. The Kurdish-Arab relations in Iraq are not good. You have an ISIS problem, a Daesh, as we can see in Ramadi in central Iraq. Mosul remains an occupied city as far as ISIS is concerned. There is a division in the government in Baghdad. So where, I ask you, is the progress? This is dreaming. We hoped one could come to that conclusion, but it's far from the reality on the ground.
So why do you think that Washington is maintaining that it has made things better for the Iraqi people then? Do they believe what they say, or is politics at play here?
Unless there is schizophrenia here involved, I would say they can't possibly believe in the argument that Iraq is better off today than it was a few years ago. The deterioration is very, very obvious. And if you are looking for indicators, go and look at those who are now taking the long journey away from Iraq into the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, into Greece, ending up on the fences of Hungary that come from Iraq. Then I think you can come to a different conclusion.
So is Washington maintaining this stance then? It's got an inability to swallow its pride and admit its policy was wrong?
No, I don't think it's just so superficial pride involved. I think it's the fear that to the number of serious failures, foreign policy failures, military security failures that have occurred in recent years. What am I talking about? Go and look at Libya. Is Libya better off since military intervention? Is Afghanistan now at a point where it can start rebuilding its nation on its own? Nowhere. So the number of failures is growing, and naturally the political reaction in Washington is to try to cover this up as much as possible.
Okay, unfortunately time has beaten us, but thank you very much for your insight here on RT International. Thank you very much.